The dawn of January 24th, 1945, broke over the Alsace region of France. It arrived not with sunlight, but with a biting, merciless wind. This drove the temperature down to a bone-chilling 10 degrees below zero. In this completely frozen wasteland, the relentless, heavy snowfall masked a chaotic and terrifying reality hidden beneath. This was a place where even the warm moisture in a soldier's breath turned instantly to solid ice in the freezing air. The frozen earth suddenly began to violently tremble. This completely shattered the dead silence of the winter morning. 6 massive German Eiger tanks appeared. These 60-ton steel behemoths were seemingly forged in the depths of hell. They roared fiercely through the blinding white. Their massive engines screamed as they crushed everything in their path. Swarming around these nearly impenetrable fortresses of metal were 600 heavily armed and fanatical infantrymen. They moved forward like a darkened, relentless tide. Their singular objective was to obliterate the American defense line. Standing against this overwhelming tsunami of armored men, 30 yards ahead of the terrified American positions, lay a wildly incongruous sight. A single solitary figure was pressed flat into a shallow, freezing irrigation ditch. He was not a towering cinematic super soldier. He was just a skinny, unassuming farm boy from the state of Kentucky. He stood just 5 foot 6 inches tall. He weighed a meager 120 pounds in his heavy winter gear. In that terrifying moment, the 600 bloodthirsty German soldiers had completely surrounded his lonely position. They were closing the terrifying distance to less than 10 yards. Physical escape was now an absolute impossibility. Yet, in this ultimate abyss of despair, any normal human survival instinct would entirely and completely shatter. This frail young officer gripped a freezing field telephone. He screamed a command to the artillery command center. This order would make the blood of anyone listening run completely cold. Fire on my position, execute the mission. For 3 agonizing hours of absolute slaughter, he had repeatedly called down devastating artillery fire in a circle. He was tightening it around himself, until finally he chose to bring the massive rain of death down upon his own head. How did a man make this seemingly suicidal decision? He was in a killing field thoroughly plowed by howitzer shells. The very earth was violently scorched to glass. What kind of indomitable spirit resided within that slender frame? And perhaps most baffling of all, why did this battlefield god single-handedly save his entire military battalion? He hid his unimaginable glory in a battered cardboard box for over half a century, never speaking a single word of it. Today we tear through the freezing blizzard of history. We uncover the awe-inspiring and tragically forgotten epic tale. This is the journey of First Lieutenant Garland Murl Conner. To truly comprehend the absolute miracle of that morning, we must drag our gaze back to the horrific death trap known as the Colmar Pocket. It was a brutal and freezing winter. Spanning the end of 1944 into 1945, the continent was suffocating under ice and blood. The Colmar Pocket was the Third Reich's last stubborn foothold on French soil. This was not a minor tactical nuisance. It was a vast and lethal expanse. It covered 850 square miles of frozen forests and snow farmland. It was anchored to the west by the freezing currents of the Rhine River. Since November, the Germans had dug in like ticks. They utilized the punishing terrain and their own desperate fanaticism to shatter wave after wave of Allied combat assaults. The French First Army had already paid a catastrophic price in blood trying to push the Germans back across the Rhine River. For Hitler, this pocket was the final shield of the Empire's dignity in the West. To break the tightening Allied combat noose, the Nazis launched Operation Nordwind on New Year's Day. It was the final and desperate major offensive on the Western Front. The High Command issued draconian orders to Army Group G. They needed to shatter the American lines in Alsace at any cost. While the infamous Battle of the Bulge raged furiously 300 miles to the north, the German 19th Army remained. The troops within the Colmar Pocket remained a terrifyingly potent force. They fought like the unpredictable cornered wolves. As the clock ticked toward the early hours of January 24th, the shadow of annihilation descended upon house and town. The freezing temperature plummeted even further. A blinding winter blizzard quickly draped the world in a heavy white shroud. The men of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, and 3rd Infantry Division were huddled in shallow, frozen foxholes. They had desperately chipped out of the thick ice. Their extremities were numb and their uniforms frozen solid to their skin. Falling asleep was nothing more than a dangerous fantasy. This military unit was teetering on the edge of human endurance. Over the preceding 2 weeks, the 3rd Battalion had been trapped in a relentless meat grinder, losing 43 good men. This was mostly due to unending harassing artillery fire and the invisible lethal stings of German snipers in the tree lines. Their defensive perimeter was worn dangerously thin. It was stretched like a fraying wire snapping under the heavy tension. At exactly 7:15 in the morning, the quiet was pulverized. German artillery batteries erupted in a deafening chorus. They were unleashing a terrible monsoon of death. Countless heavy shells rained down on the 3rd Battalion's forward bases. The massive shockwaves uprooted ancient treason, snapped them like twigs. Tons of frozen mud and dice boulders were hurled. Jagged and red-hot shrapnel were hurled high into the sky. They were falling back to earth like a demented lethal hailstorm. This preparatory barrage was designed to pave the way for an armored spearhead. It lasted for 12 excruciating minutes. When the big guns finally ceased, a new sound bled from the tree line. It came before the ringing and their ears began to fade. It was a far more terrifying sound. It was the grinding metallic screech of heavy tracks biting into the winter permafrost. It was the deepened guttural thrum of 60-ton mechanical beasts. A forward runner stumbled into the battalion column and post. He was gasping out military intelligence that stopped every heart in the room. The terrifying German counterattack was here. 6 of the pride of the German Armored Corps were there. The fearsome Tiger tanks were accompanied by hundreds of infantry. They were bulldozing through the thick woods. They aimed directly at the infantry battalion's critically weakened left flank. The battalion commander stared at his tactical map. A cold sweat instantly soaked through his heavy and thick combat shirt. He knew with absolute terrifying certainty that the 3rd Battalion was not just facing a retreat into the freezing forest. They were facing an absolute massacre. There was not a single American tank on their line to counter these metallic monsters. There was no anti-tank weapon capable of scratching them. If those 6 Tigers broke through the defense, it would be over. With their virtually impenetrable frontal armor, they would simply roll over the dangerously shallow American foxhole defense. They would crush the terrified men inside. It was a completely hopeless and mathematically impossible combat situation right now. The only force on Earth capable of stopping 600 men and 6 heavy tanks was massive concentrated American firepower. They needed the artillery batteries miles to the rear, but heavy artillery firing blind into the snow is just making noise. Big guns desperately needed eyes. They needed a forward observer to low-crawl into the absolute zero of no man's land. Someone to read the chaotic German military formations and mathematically guide the hammer of the gods down upon all of them. But the nightmare deepened quickly. The forward observation post had been completely vaporized in the 12-minute barrage. The military observers were either dead or critically wounded. The desperate 3rd Battalion was rendered completely blind. In this suffocating moment, the survival of hundreds of men hung by a microscopic thread. A remarkably unremarkable man stood. He volunteered for a mission that was a guaranteed death sentence. This was First Lieutenant Garland Murl Conner. When you examine this war hero's military record, the physical dissonance is absolutely staggering to comprehend. Conner was a 25-year-old kid from a dirt-poor tobacco farm located in Clinton County, Kentucky. He was humble. He was a very quiet farm boy who had not even had the chance to properly finish his high school education back home. He fit absolutely none of the Hollywood cinematic stereotypes of a chiseled and invincible action movie superstar. He was small and frail. He was drowning in his oversized winter gear, looking as though a stiff breeze could blow him away. Yet inside this extremely fragile vessel burned the most ferociously resilient warrior soul on the entire European front. Drafted in March 1940, just months before Pearl Harbor, he danced on the dangerous razor's edge of the abyss. He had miraculously survived 10 major and completely blood-soaked military campaigns over the last 4 brutal years. He had aggressively stormed the heavily defended enemy beaches in for separate and completely nightmarish assaults. His physical body was a living and breathing testament to the absolute savagery of war. He was pierced by enemy bullets. He had been brutally broken by enemy bullets and explosive shrapnel on 7 different and truly terrifying occasions. Just 3 weeks prior, he had been medically evacuated to a rear military hospital to treat his 7th severe wound. But the sterile and quiet safety of a comfortable military hospital ward could not hold this deeply dedicated soldier. Just 2 days before this apocalyptic morning, Conner had literally sneaked out of the hospital in the dead of the night. His combat wounds were still incredibly fresh and aching. He bravely navigated through the frozen European hellscape. He did this just to find his military unit and return to the freezing misery of the deadly front-line combat trenches. Over 4 years of relentless combat, his astonishing bravery in firefights had already earned him 4 Silver Star medals. And now this battered, bruised, and heavily bleeding veteran looked at the oncoming wave of death and made his heroic choice. There were absolutely no cinematic, dramatic speeches. There were no moments of dramatic hesitation from the brave soldier. Conner simply grabbed a heavy archaic field telephone. He slung a massive spool of black telephone wire over his left arm. This heavy wire was 400 yards long. He took a ragged breath of freezing air and then boldly launched himself out. He jumped directly from the command bunker into the screaming winter blizzard. His objective was a totally exposed patch. It was an area of death entirely devoid of cover, located hundreds of yards beyond the safety of the American defense lines. The tactical reality of his desperate run was completely suicidal. The German soldiers were laying down, suppressing fire. They fired to cover their heavy tanks, while the American artillery was desperately firing blind to slow the enemy advance. Conner was sprinting directly through a dual intersecting kill zone. He was not just dodging incoming Nazi artillery shells. He had to pray he was not entirely evaporated by his own brothers. It was a terrifying and desperate sprint against death. Every time his boots struck the ground, they crashed through the frozen crust of the snow, creating a loud crunching rhythm. His left arm ached as the heavy wire unspooled into the violent storm. His right hand firmly gripped the phone receiver. He held the heavy receiver like a vital lifeline. By the time he successfully hit the 100-yard combat marker line, German forward military observers easily spotted the lone and crazy American soldier running straight through the deep snow. The gray winter sky were open. The heavy artillery fell rapidly. A massive shell detonated violently 40 yards away. It was instantly followed by another 30 yards to his right. This completely engulfed his peripheral vision in black smoke. It created blinding or inch fire. The enemy gunners were slowly walking their highly explosive rounds directly toward him. They were bracketing his running figure. Suddenly, a pinpoint strike vaporized a massive tree 70 yards in his path. The deafening crack of the trunk splitting was followed by a lethal shotgun blast of razor-sharp flying with splinters. Jagged steel shrapnel tore wildly through the freezing air around him. Conner did not even break his fast running stride. His brain had seemingly entirely decoupled from the very concept of human fear. Seconds later, another heavy shell slammed down. It hit the earth a mere 20 yards behind him. The concussive, invisible fist of the shockwave punched him squarely in the back. He was thrown violently forward. He stumbled and nearly face-planted into the freezing ice, but caught his balance. Through sheer impossible willpower, he drove his legs forward and kept running. That thin black wire kept unspooling. It connected his desperate heartbeat to the heavy artillery guns in the rear. He crossed the 250-yard mark. The terrifying hellscape intensified. Another heavy artillery shell shrieked down from the sky, obliterating a tree. It hit right in his line of advance. The burning, shattered trunk crashed down into the snow directly in front of him. Without slowing down, he vaulted over the blazing wood like a track star. Searing hot, twisted metal fragments hissed. They hit the deep snow around him, sending up blinding plumes of white steam. The artillery density reached an apex. A massive, high, explosive artillery shell detonated a mere 15 yards away. The frozen earth flipped upside down. A massive geyser of frozen mud and shattered steel erupted skyward. The high-frequency shockwave slammed his eardrums. It instantly stripped away his hearing entirely. The terrifying world went completely, terrifyingly mute for him. It was replaced only by a piercing and maddening high-pitched tringing. He could not even hear his own ragged breathing. But he somehow miraculously made it through, after surviving 400 yards of uninterrupted explosive hellfire. 30 yards ahead of the American defense lines, he found his chosen fortress. It was a frozen agricultural ditch. It was extremely pathetic and perhaps 18 inches deep. It offered absolutely zero ballistic protection to him, let alone massive, high, explosive artillery. But for the incredibly brave military observer, it was a perfect position. By pressing his dirt-covered face directly into the freezing dirt, his eyes set just millimeters above the white snow line. It rendered him practically invisible to the enemy, while granting him a flawless panoramic view of the war machine. He threw his exhausted body into the ditch and frantically cranked the handle on the heavy military field telephone. It was an absolute miracle that the wire line had not snapped. A frantic voice crackled through the earpiece receiver. It was the distant American Artillery Fire Direction Center. Conner instantly transformed into an apex predator of war. With an eerily common, almost robotic cadence, he fed them his exact coordinates and the position of the enemy forces. Enemy infantry assembling in the open field at 600 meters. They are adjusting formation, so request fire mission. Conner was now locked in a terrifying tactical paradox. If the advancing Germans spotted him before the shells landed, a single burst of machine gun fire would completely end him. But if he called the heavy American shells into close, the devastating 105mm rounds would obliterate the ditch and vaporize him entirely instantly. Staring down this double-barreled threat of certain and complete death, his eyes remained incredibly fixed and cold. 40 seconds after he transmitted the coordinates, the sky bore open. 12 massive howitzer shells shrieked down. They fell from the heavens like falling stars. They impacted with surgical precision, dead center in the German area. The winter tree line was instantly swallowed by overlapping gigantic spheres of bright orange fire in thick black smoke. Mud and snow and the shattered bodies of German infantrymen were violently hurled high into the freezing winter sky. Conner kept his eyes locked firmly on the carnage. He continuously fed complicated mathematical corrections to the phone. The American artillery batteries hit their absolute maximum cyclic rate. It was 4 rounds per minute for every gun. Every 60 seconds, 48 mountain leveling shells hammered the German advance. It was an invisible sledgehammer. It was smashing relentlessly against the terrifying Nazi tide. But the heavily armored mechanized monsters did not flinch. The 6 heavy Tiger tanks simply ground forward through the curtains of explosive fire, trusting their frontal armor. They smashed forcefully through the burning forest while violently crushing absolutely everything in their dark path. The veteran panzer commanders quickly deduced the source of the lethal American accuracy and began traversing their guns. They blindly fired their massive 88mm main guns directly into the fragile American infantry lines. One heavy shell screamed directly over his head and detonated 300 yards behind him in an American foxhole. It instantly killed the occupant. The mechanical shrieks of the tanked Rebs grew absolutely deafening and terrifying. They were now a mere 300 yards from the incredibly fragile American defense perimeter in the freezing snow. From his absolutely pathetic and completely frozen wrench, Conner watched in extreme frustration as the heavy shells hit. The 105mm shrapnel just pinged completely harmlessly off the highly sloped armor of the tanks. The heavy hull-mounted machine guns of the massive metal beasts suddenly began to fiercely sing in the freezing winter. They were violently spitting out exactly 800 rounds a minute directly toward the fragile American foxhole line. A completely blinding storm of bright green tracer fire whipped violently through the dark and heavily frozen pine woods. The flying bullets were reading the thick branches and aggressively chewing up the white snow just inches above him. The terrifying supersonic rounds snapped through the freezing air and nearly severed his incredibly fragile telephone wire. Was this incredibly massive and heavy armored spearhead truly completely unstoppable? Then the chaos delivered a miracle. A completely blind American heavy shell plummeted rapidly from the sky and scored an impossible direct hit on the machine. It landed exactly squarely on the heavy right steel track of the imposing lead Tiger tank leading the terrifying advance. With an absolutely deafening and sharp metallic snap that echoed loudly over the explosions, the heavy treads blew apart. The incredibly massive 60-ton tank violently lurched to the right side and sank deeply into the heavy freezing snow. It was entirely, completely immobilized. The heavy armored turrets spun, wildly searching for a target before falling silent. Seconds later, lightning unbelievably struck twice. Another heavy shell perfectly impacted the rear deck of a second tank. A truly massive bright orange fireball fiercely erupted from the vulnerable engine area of the heavily armored metal beast. This was followed almost instantly by a thick column of heavy choking black smoke shooting directly into the freezing sky. The powerful heavy engine was completely dead. The terrifying and once invincible massive tank was now a burning steel ruin. Seeing their proud armored leaders brutally paralyzed, the remaining four heavy tanks panicked and completely spread out. They firmly halted their aggressive advance, choosing instead to just sit back and forcefully use their heavy main guns. They provided heavy covering fire for the surviving infantry. Stripped of their armored shields, the infantry did not retreat. Fueled entirely by absolute fanaticism and utter desperation, they aggressively swarmed forward like a disturbed ant colony. They were recklessly running directly through the incredibly heavy and completely devastating American artillery barrage. They were boldly climbing over the fully pulverized and bloody remains of their own fallen comrades to close the gap. The critical survival distance was rapidly evaporating in the deep snow. 100 yards, 50 yards, 30 yards. Conner lay pressed completely flat into the ice. His exhausted voice was a hoarsened, incredibly ragged, desperate whisper. He was continuously feeding new coordinate numbers into the phone, dragging the American wall of explosions closer to him. The terrifying world all around him was an unrecognizable and chaotic nightmare of incredibly loud and deafening noise. He was surrounded by the horrific heavy stench of vaporized human blood and cord that mixed with the falling frozen dirt. The explosive shells forcefully walked in closer, 20 yards away, then an excruciatingly close, terrifying 15 yards. Finally, a massive and completely devastating 105mm shell detonated a mere 10 yards from his head. It was an incredibly terrifying dance on the sharp razor's edge of a burning sun. The concussive wave hit him very hard. It physically lifted his frail body entirely out of the shallow ditch and tossed him like a helpless ragdoll in the air. It violently slammed his bruised body back down hard into the unyielding frozen earth. His ears were now heavily bleeding. Boiling hot dirt razor sharp ice chunks and jagged steel shrapnel rained down extremely hard on his metal helmet and spine. Yet he remained firmly fused to the freezing earth. His incredibly tight grip on the muddy telephone receiver was unbroken. Through heavily bleeding lips, he kept adjusting the deadly fire, practically walking the heavy artillery onto his own helmet. He knew with terrifying absolute certainty that if the heavy guns stopped firing for exactly 60 seconds, they would die. The incredibly violent winter battle finally reached its absolute terrifying apex of complete blood-soaked battlefield madness. The surviving German infantry, possessed by a terrifying feral rage, forcefully launched a final all-or-nothing sprint forward. The tactical gap closed entirely. The front line of the Germanist alt was now less than 10 yards from the ditch. From this terrifyingly intimate distance, the advancing soldiers could look down and clearly see the mud-caked observer. The American observer was curled tightly in the snow, clutching a telephone. 600 heavily armed men enveloped him. They had completely surrounded his position. The Grim Reaper had finally placed his cold hand on his exhausted shoulder. In this ultimate countdown to his own execution, surrounded by a forest of black gun barrels, First Lieutenant Garland sat. Murl Conner made the critical decision that would echo in eternity. He pulled the heavy receiver closely to his mouth. Pulling every ounce of strength left in his battered 120-pound frame, he screamed the final order. He screamed the chilling coordinate loudly into the phone. "Fire on my position. I repeat, fire on my position. Execute." A terrifying absolute silence fell over the fire direction center miles away. The artillery commander's hand trembled. He trembled, holding the receiver. He looked at his plotting board. The coordinates Conner just called were unbelievable. They were less than 50 yards from his own location. The lethal kill radius of a high explosive shell is 50 yards. To execute this terrifying order meant turning that entire grid square into a crater. It meant murdering their own man. The artillery officer hesitated, and his voice was catching in his throat. But Conner did not beg. He did not waver. His voice cut through the static, colder and harder than the ice he lay on. "Fire on my position. Execute the mission." The hesitation finally broke. The lethal order was given. 12 105mm howitzers roared out. The heavy guns roared in unison. The sky above Conner ripped open with a shrieking and completely apocalyptic wail. 12 massive shells carrying the absolute wrath of God slammed perfectly into the dead center of Conner's position. A gigantic blinding pillar of bright orange fire and blacks, smoke shot hundreds of feet into the freezing winter sky. The massive shockwave violently knocked grown men off their feet miles away. Tons of earth into the shattered remnants. The remnants of the Germanist alt force were vaporized into a terrifying red and black mushroom cloud in the field. In this epicenter of absolute and saturated destruction, nothing biological could possibly survive the intense explosion. The 600 men of the Germanist alt wave were simply deleted from existence when the thunder finally rolled away. An eerie, suffocating silence blanketed the entire battlefield. The Americans in their foxholes stared in stunned horror. They stared at the smoking, cratered moonscape where their observer had been. Hot tears froze on their dirty faces. Everyone knew without a shadow of a doubt that the skinny kid from Kentucky had just sacrificed himself to save them. They believed his frail body was blown to atoms in the massive blast, but war is a place where physics bows to miracles. Nearly an hour later, as the cold wind began to clear the toxic smoke, two brave American medics braved the unexploded. They crawled out to what was left of the ditch. What they found completely shattered their understanding of reality. At the bottom of that shallow 18-inch depression, completely buried under a mountain of mud, ice and bloody gore. First, Lieutenant Garland Murl Conner was still breathing. His hearing was utterly destroyed by the massive explosions. A jagged piece of hot shrapnel had torn deeply into his leg. His blood was rapidly turning the white winter snow black. Yet his hand was still locked in a desperate death grip around the field telephone, and his eyes were still scanning. He was scanning the tree line. That pathetic 18-inch ditch had shielded him from the direct blast wave of his guns. The unbelievable post-battle statistics were absolutely staggering. For 3 unbroken hours, armed with just a telephone, armed with impossible courage, Conner had single-handedly broken a coordinated assault by 600 elite infantrymen. He stopped 6 heavy tanks. Over 50 Germans had been blown to pieces and over 150 severely wounded. The fragile defense lines of the 3rd Battalion held firm. Hundreds of American boys lived to see another sunrise. If a man did this unbelievable action today, his face would be plastered on every single television screen on the earth. He would be completely drowning in lucrative book deals, massive parades, and overwhelming public adoration and respect. But this titan of war chose a path that breaks the heart as much as it inspires it. He chose absolute and broken silence. Discharged from the military in June 1945, the brave Conner finally took off his blood-stained uniform. He went back to the completely quiet and beautifully rolling hills of Clinton County, located in the state of Kentucky. He married a very beautiful young girl named Pauline Wells, and they soon moved into a completely dilapidated cabin. It was located on Indian Creek, and they had absolutely no modern electricity and completely no running tap water there. The brave man who successfully commanded the absolute fury of the heavy artillery now walked quietly behind a mule. He was tilling the farm earth and growing green tobacco and corn while finding his ultimate peace in the dark dirt. He eventually became the dedicated president of the local farm bureau, serving his community for 17 long years. He completely dedicated his peaceful life to helping his local neighbors and fighting for the disabled war veterans. His physical body paid the heavy toll of war. The brutal combat conditions left him with completely severe diabetes. He also suffered greatly from failing kidneys, yet he never once complained and never asked his country for a favor. His personal relationship with his immense and undeniable military glory was almost tragically and completely humble. He took his staggering collection of heavy medals, including 4 silver stars and 3 beautiful Purple Heart medals. He also had the French Croix de Guerre. He unceremoniously dumped them all deeply into a very cheap cardboard box. He forcefully shoved them into a dark duffel bag and buried them in the deepest and darkest corner of a wooden closet. His young wife, Pauline, accidentally stumbled upon the hidden box and visibly gasped at the heavy military war medals. Asking him exactly what he had done, the incredibly iron-willed veteran simply looked away and softly muttered to her, "I simply just did what I essentially had to do." He absolutely never spoke of his incredible military actions ever again. He successfully built an impenetrable mental fortress around the terrifying memories of the roaring, heavy Tiger tanks. He completely hid the horrific smell of burning human flesh and the screaming artillery burying the superhero deeply. He firmly maintained this absolute silence for over 50 years, completely hiding within the quiet and peaceful farmer. It was absolutely not until 1996, by sheer cosmic accident, that this buried historic epic was unearthed. Richard Chilton, a Green Beret veteran, was actively researching his own brave uncle who tragically died at Anzio Beach. He was continuously digging through the extremely dusty archives of the 3rd Infantry Division military combat records. Time and time again, he kept seeing one specific name completely dominating the historical military after action reports. When Chilton carefully read the clinical military account of January 24th, he was totally paralyzed with shock. He was completely furious to discover that this brave man had absolutely never been awarded the highest Medal of Honor. He was arguably one of the absolute greatest individual military heroes in the entire American historical combat history. Chilton successfully tracked down the aging hero. Conner was 77 with an incredibly weak body and failing kidneys. When Chilton passionately recounted the battlefield reports, insisting the nation completely owed him its highest honor. The old farmer just listened completely quietly. A single cloudy tear slowly rolled down his incredibly weathered cheek. It was a completely silent tribute to the boys who did not come home into quiet peace with his own personal life choices. Just 2 short years later, on November 5, 1998, the incredibly brave man passed away completely quietly. The invincible man, the heavy Nazi war machine absolutely could not kill, died from severe heart failure at 79. But the final massive historical battle for the unforgettable legacy of Conner was just finally and completely beginning. His brave widow Pauline was empowered by Chilton's extensive research and flatly refused any bureaucratic government apathy. She completely refused to let it bury her brave husband's ultimate sacrifice. She launched a 20-year justice crusade. They scoured the dusty archives, miraculously locating surviving combat soldiers who actually watched Conner in that ditch. They successfully gathered an absolutely unshakable mountain of vivid eyewitness testimonies to submit the official request. They officially submitted the military upgrade request to the Army Board for Correction in the year 1997. The strict bureaucracy coldly slammed the heavy door, entirely citing the total expiration of the statutory legal time limit. They officially completely rejected them in the year 1997 and then once again in the year 2000 fully. But the incredibly brave widow Pauline was completely relentless. In the year 2014, in a bold, stunning move, she bravely sued the massive United States military in federal court, though the judge ruled the statute of limitation ended. The sheer emotional weight of the completely buried historical story caught massive fire. The hard case moved into mediation. Famous military generals, historians, and powerful politicians completely rallied to her side. The pressure was insurmountable. The massive Pentagon finally completely yielded, reviewing the evidence and unanimously recommending the official medal upgrade. The massive wheel of human history finally completely clicked directly into place on June 26, 2018. It was the beautiful East Room of the White House, 20 long years after her extremely brave husband took his last breath. The 89-year-old, incredibly strong widow Pauline stood incredibly proudly below the completely bright chandelier. Before flashing world press cameras, the United States President respectfully draped the completely prestigious military medal. He officially draped the Medal of Honor, the great nation's absolute highest military award for incredible valor, into her hands. The incredibly powerful historical words of the official military citation were completely etched deeply into pure solid stone. First Lieutenant Garland Murl Conner entirely distinguished himself by acts of incredible military gallantry and intrepidity. He was voluntarily running 400 yards directly through incredibly heavy and completely devastating enemy artillery fire. He was brilliantly directing heavy artillery for 3 completely unbroken hours from an incredibly exposed freezing position. He was incredibly calling completely devastating and highly explosive heavy artillery fire directly down upon his own position. His absolutely extraordinary and completely unimaginable individual military heroism totally saved his large combat battalion. The incredible life journey of Garland Murl Conner is the absolute ultimate historical definition of what it means to be hero. He went from a physically frail and completely uneducated farm boy to an absolutely unbreakable and true legendary god of war. He went from a completely silent and deeply suffering farmer, entirely hiding his unimaginable military glory in a dark closet, to proudly standing absolutely forever in the incredibly eternal pantheon of the absolute greatest warriors in human history. His incredible historical life screams a completely universal truth. True ultimate bravery is purely not the absence of fear. It is the incredibly hard choice to deliberately step directly into the fire for the terrified men standing right behind you. You perform this incredibly heroic action despite being totally and completely terrified to your absolute core by the violence. And true absolute historical greatness is fully not found in seeking the bright spotlight when the heavy battle smoke clears. It is found in having the incredibly quiet strength to gently fold up the heavy cape and return home to simply be a good man. If you want to absolutely uncover more incredibly hardcore breakdowns of history, miss completely deadly military miscalculations, please absolutely smash that supportive like button and completely subscribe to our historical military observation channel now. I am your incredibly dedicated and completely analytical strategy observer. I will definitely see you on the next battlefield. Until the time comes, please always remember that true historical heroes often walk among us in absolute and complete silence.